frequency bands. So 28 is the very practical solution at this stage. And also, if we see the only countries who announced to implement 5G, the US is only one. And maybe Korea and Japan will follow, but the USA has a very clear vision, so we don't want to miss the US market. Is a big market for our industry. So we should not forget the US market, so 28 GHz will be implemented first, and then we'd like to support other frequency bands. But it may be the answer.
I have a few thoughts about the 28 gigahertz band, as you might imagine. Obviously, phones today are switchable, so they use multiple frequencies. So harmonization on a global level is not an end-all, be-all. You don't have to have the same frequencies everywhere. But on 28, you're not going to get harmonization. Now, Tim's original slide was a little bit premature by saying the U.S. is starting to use 28 gigahertz. That's not correct. They haven't even notice of proposed rulemaking to examine how it possibly can be used. And the U.S. is a unique situation because they, years ago, made a frequency allocation placing FSS as secondary in that band, whereas in the rest of the world, it's a co-primary. So right off the bat, it's not the best example to use, and we don't even know what the results of the U.S. NPRM are going to be. It's a unique situation. Europe strongly opposed to 28. They don't often use that type of language in C-Telcom proposals. So you're not going to get Region 1 involved with 28 gigahertz. We don't see it as an area for good harmonization. We, as a satellite industry, would like to avoid conflict like we had at the last radio conference by selecting frequencies which are usable and a win-win situation, which is why SOA in Brussels has argued that you should look at the 31 gigahertz, which can be globally harmonized. But those are just my thoughts on 28.
I forgot to add one thing. Yes, it would be wonderful to identify one single frequency band worldwide. That is the best solution. But if you review the WS15 outcomes, it is very different to the country by country. So in Korea, 28 gigahertz is not used heavily for satellite service. But in other countries, in European countries, they use for satellite service. So we can have choice. So if I have a harmonization based on spectrum, it will be good. But it's time to consider technical implementation of harmonization. So if I said before, the one single chip, so why this phone is very expensive? There's so many, more 20 or 30 frequency bands are embedded in this phone. That makes a price high. So if we implement it on a single chip, and you can selectively use, so in European country, 25, and in Korea, 28. But it can be implemented in a single chip. So we can consider the technical implementation of harmonization, not the spectrum. So we don't want to push the 28 gigahertz should be used worldwide, even in other countries. So that may be our view. Thank you.
And just a question from me based on that. You said that one of the reasons you wanted to move to 28 was that it was a timing thing to be able to do it very quickly. Do you think in the long term you might move away from using 28?
Yes, US are very clear position, so they want to use that. So Korea has a very big industry, so we should support the devices to the US. So we should not forget the technicals.
Stefan Seeler from Coleago. Also a question with regards to the 28 gigahertz trial at the Olympics. What applications do you envisage to be run in that band?
I don't know in detail, but some are very promising applications may be virtual reality, because in higher frequency bands we can provide very wide bandwidth. They can use the 360 degrees of virtual reality, so they can offer the bus, so or hologram. Even though it is very small image, maybe 4 or 5 inches of hologram on the table, maybe, and also the other very useful data from players at games, but I don't know any detail.
I can offer a brief note about our use of 28 gigahertz today and not in the future, where we're putting up high throughput satellites using 28 gigahertz as gateway stations for service to airplanes, aeronautical service, for broadband service across continental land masses, for delivery of video that consumers are demanding, and also for high density FSS in Europe, which has been allocated for some years now. So there's already 28 gigahertz services, and it's been studied and analyzed, and now we're putting satellites in the sky to use it.
Okay, further questions? Yes, take one back.
Alan Jamieson from New Zealand and EP2. Yesterday we heard encouragements for members of the AP2 to participate actively in the work of the ITUR. Today I'd like to make a plug in the opposite direction. In the presentations we heard of the importance of gaining spectrum, access to spectrum. Because if you don't have spectrum, you don't have a service. It's as simple as that. So the process internationally that we have to go through to gain spectrum points to the importance of the regional groups, such as the AP2. So my advertisement for the AP2 is to encourage even those who are perhaps not based in the Asia-Pacific region, but rather to recognise the importance of this region in the future of 5G and the convergence of other services as well, because of the sheer weight of population that we represent in the Asia-Pacific region, to participate in the activities of the AP2. To gain spectrum, it is important that support from regional groups is obtained well in advance of the WRCs. So it is important, and it's really in the vested interest of all those who are interested in gaining spectrum to ensure that they participate not only in their own regional group, but in other regional groups as well. End of the advertisement. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that? Anyone wants really a question? But this space, another question on the front.
Thanks, Scott. One question in relation to LTEB. We didn't hear much mention of that during the presentations. In fact, we heard more from the Korean side about using the spectrum for 4K digital terrestrial transmission. Is LTEB within the sort of 5G envelope? Is it a key way to get that spectrum that you've been talking about by taking some of the broadcasting onto those networks? Is that an option that's being looked at? And some general thoughts about that from the panel.
So just in case anyone's not sure, LTE is broadcast over LTE. Effectively, it's a replacement for DTT. Or anyone have any comments on that? Sure.
We certainly expect a lot of video transmissions to be on mobile, and there are discussions of having 5G and current existing systems providing mobile broadcasting in one sense or another. But today, satellites carry over 1 terabyte of data across the globe, and you just don't want to put that on mobile networks. You want to keep that as a broadcast function and not as a point-to-point unicast function. So there's got to be a universe in which both exist. I like watching video on my mobile device as much as anyone else, but then again, people at home are going to watch the big screens, and that's going to come in by cable, by satellite, by fiber, and by mobile.
I would generally agree with that. I'd say that LTE was seen a few years ago as being a very key thing for trying to get DTT networks to give up some spectrum. You saw the massive growth in video on the slides, and we saw it yesterday as well. That video is not linear video, that is almost all internet video and on demand and so on. Linear video is still largely being driven by traditional platforms. And the question is, if you want to move linear video onto the internet and onto LTE and so on, then you're going to have to make some even bigger assumptions over the way that traffic is growing. So I think LTE could have a place to play, but I think that in order for it to do that, you're going to have even more capacity on networks to be able to cope with it. I think until now that it's been possible to think about it being included on existing networks, but with the massive increase in LTE capacity, including, and it's growing even faster than everyone thought because of the induced demand problem. It may be that there's just not enough space on networks to be able to run effectively. But it's certainly something that people should be keeping an eye on. Are there any other questions? Oh, sorry.
I would just like to say something related to LTE broadcast. There are solutions that we have in LTE specifications, and there are a number of trials, and there are some interests both in Australia and with Telstra and in US to use that type of solutions, MVMS, in LTE technology for not especially for large arenas where you can see and recap what has happened in various events. And also, as I showed on the first slide I had, the growth of video then in different forms, streaming and delayed viewing, like video on demand, etc. So, but that is unicast solutions, and by switching to broadcast, it will be quite an efficient way of transmitting.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I thought there's one here.
Thank you very much. I'm Hiếu from Vietnam. We are saturated with hyperized in the big data and capability of 5G to cope with the reality with broadband everywhere. That has been pointed out, like an example from Korea, and has been captured nicely by presentation by Madam Kim. And we are now start talking about how the future will desperately need narrowband, as pointed out in Dr. Hakam's presentation with all IoT and end-to-end complications. So I'm wondering that should 5G address these two worlds, broadband and massive narrowband as a unified broadband, unified platform, and as a regulator, should we start to draft a new national narrowband plan in addition to the national broadband plan? Thank you.
So, panel, should 5G try to be a jack of all trades? Yes, do you want to start?
Korea is facing the situation regulation-free system. So we are deleting some very obstacles for promoting industry. So narrowband can be applied, can be used by operators by their own, but it is not that planned. But we'd like to give the freedom for operators to use whether it is narrowband or broadband. So within their band, and also Internet of Things. It may be the unlicensed band, but we already faced a problem if once unlicensed devices is placed, it seems to be super primary because we can. It is very difficult to clear unlicensed device from the market. So maybe we try to find some circumstance for Internet of Things application by application, but I did not involved in this job.
I know this is a spectrum management conference and we're talking only about spectrum issues, but I think actually for new narrowband plans, the emphasis is going to be less on spectrum and more on rules that affect the economic systems and infrastructure and sectors that use narrowband. You'll need new rules for connected cars and how they're going to operate. You'll need new rules for consumer safety and protection when devices are talking to each other in your refrigerators, ordering a whole case of milk when you only wanted one. You'll need new rules for privacy and data security. And those are going to be a lot more important than the narrowband spectrum. The major narrowband spectrum issue is going to be between licensed and unlicensed spectrum. You'll probably want to encourage much more unlicensed spectrum for all the different applications to flourish, so you don't have a licensing structure that impedes the use of new narrowband services. That's the spectrum aspect of it, but I think there are a lot of other aspects you're going to face as well.
Yes, thank you. I think that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that the commercial platform is a good starting point, and using commercial frequency bands as well. You don't need to specify specific unless there is safety involved. Then there might be a need to have a certain frequency band that is assigned, and maybe even a specific technology in order to handle safety, life of safety aspects or applications. And when it comes to regulations, then this is something that for sure need to be looked at. We need some regulations around the new applications that we see. Then especially talking about safety. Self-driving cars, who is responsible if it crashes or even kills? So that type of regulations is probably needed when we go forward. And at the same time, it's important that such regulations do not prohibit the how we go forward, the innovation, and various aspects like that.
I just jump in and echo the need to look at security policies and just make sure, for instance, that if your car is driving yourself, you're still controlling it and not someone else. Or your home where you've got connections to your water and your energy and whether your security system in your house is on or off. And just making sure that those are secure networks.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time left. There are a couple more questions, so please come and ask the panel during the break. We've now got 15 minutes for coffee, so if you can be back in this room at 11:15. But,
Ladies and gentlemen, just before we start the next session, just a quick announcement. Just wanted to remind everyone that there is once again going to be a workshop taking place run by ITU and ISFAN. That will be taking place immediately after the end of the day today in the room just next door there. And the workshop today is going to be looking at software and applications. So there's a little bit more information on that in your pack. Otherwise, if you find ISFAN, I'm sure he's happy to explain exactly what he's going to be covering, but hopefully that's something that a lot of you are able to join us for. Okay, I'd like to now pass over to Amit and we'll start the next session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dan, and good morning to you all again. Here we are on day 2. I think we had an absolutely excellent session just previously, just looking at the world of 5G and doing a bit of crystal ball gazing for the future. I suppose my job is to bring this a little bit back in time to the immediate short term, to remember to think about this. We've seen all these charts of rising data traffic volumes. How do we actually solve them in the short to medium term before 5G comes along with all its new spectrum and, in fact, its own increased traffic levels? But what can we do in the short term to solve the problem? And I hope that, we're all here representing different industry sectors. We've heard discussions about debates about use of spectrum and making sure that other services other than mobile are looked after and continue. But at the same time, I hope we can all remember that all of us are users of smartphones. All of us have an interest in finding a way to resolve the data traffic crunch problem. And I'm sure in working together we will find win-win solutions all around. So the way we're going to run this session is I'm going to give a very brief introductory presentation. As you can see, we have 4 very distinguished speakers, so they will come on and, if you like, do the meat of the session in terms of each of them will be giving a 10 to 15 minute presentation. And then following all the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session and an opportunity to discuss any of the points that have been raised or for you to raise any additional points that you wish. So as I say, I'll start with a very brief introductory presentation, just setting the scene for the other 4 main presentations. And really what I wanted to start off by is saying, we've seen these forecasts of data traffic growth. If you're a mobile operator, how do you deal with all that? What are the different approaches you can use? And I wanted to highlight 4 different categories of approach that you can use. First one is actually bringing new technologies into existing frequency bands. So more spectrum efficient technologies such as LT and the likes, bringing them into the old bands that have been used for 2G and maybe 3G. Second opportunity is stop the traffic from getting on the mobile network in the first place. And one option for doing that is by offloading that traffic onto the fixed telecoms network, where there is a fixed telecoms network. So in those countries where there are extensive fixed broadband networks, using Wi-Fi hotspots, using things such as femtocells, and basically making sure that the traffic never actually has to make its way onto the mobile network is a very good way of controlling, managing the capacity. Then thirdly, we have essentially one of the main topics of the conference, what about new frequency bands? And this is the one I'm going to talk a little bit about in my introductory presentation. We've talked a lot about 700 megahertz, so I'm not going to say too much on that. We've talked a bit about L-band, and we've also talked about the 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz bands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2.3 and 2.6 gigahertz bands. And then finally, the 4th option, and this is the one that mobile operators really try and avoid if they can, is that they're actually going out and deploying new sites. And the reason mobile operators try and avoid this if they can is it's typically very expensive, and it can also be quite logistically challenging. All the prime sites for antennas and the likes, all the rooftop sites and the likes, have typically already gone. So it's actually quite hard work to try and find new sites, and it does, planning permission requirements are getting harder. So it does take a lot of time. So this is if you like, the thing you do if you have no other choice. But at the same time, I think we are going to see, I think as some of the speakers and 5G speakers mentioned, we probably will see new sites coming along, particularly in the form of small cells, As we move to using higher and higher frequencies and the range is more limited, I think we will start to see more and more increased adoption of small cells and the likes on lampposts. And I heard a discussion earlier this week about putting them in manholes as well as a means of distributing them across areas where there's high traffic demand. So as I mentioned, the rest of my presentation is just very brief. I just want to talk about two particular of the new frequency bands, the 2.3 gigahertz and the 2.6 gigahertz. And the reason for mentioning those in this presentation is, well, first of all, hopefully it complements the other presentations, but also because there are two bands that have been harmonised for some years now, but are not getting that much adoption in this area. So before we start pushing for new spectrum to become available, let's make use of what has already been harmonised. And if I can start with the 2.3 gigahertz band, as probably many of you know, this runs from 2300 to 2400. It varies from country to country what it's used for. Some countries, for example, use it for military use. So in a lot of countries, it's difficult to know, it's difficult to make the whole band available, but sometimes part of the band can be made available. And it's really this region that has been the pioneer of use of this band. Originally, I think the thinking was for use for WiMAX technology, and there were quite a lot of awards of this spectrum from, I think, about 2006, 2007 onwards in many countries, with probably WiMAX in mind for use for broadband, home broadband connections and the likes. But increasingly, this band is being thought about for use for the TDD variant of LTE, and believe it or not, there's already 1,435 devices that have been launched which support LTE in this band. Now, given there's this, probably amongst us, I suspect, I would guess probably almost all of us have LTE phones, and I wouldn't be too surprised if perhaps 7 out of 10 of us already have a phone that can work with this band. So for a mobile operator, this is something where your customer base, to a large degree, already has a phone that can use this band. So this is very much, if regulators can make this spectrum available, this is a quick win for industry. And because of the Asian lead on this, Europe is actually now looking at this band. The UK is planning to auction 40 megahertz of spectrum in this band, and this is spectrum that has been released by the military and allowed to be used for commercial uses. And other European countries are also considering means of using this spectrum. The US uses this spectrum as well, but only part of the band, and they use a slightly different configuration. This has been talked about mostly across the world for use for the time division GPX variation of LTE, so the unpaired variant of LTE. In the US, there is a paired band plan, but I think this is a sort of US-Canada specific thing. For the rest of the world, it is very much about using the unpaired configuration. And it's the unpaired configuration that is in all the handsets. So the other band I wanted to briefly mention is the 2.6 gigahertz band. So this has a mixture of paired and unpaired spectrum within the European, what's called the so-called CBT band plan. I think it was originally harmonised back in WRC 2000, and it was referred to at that time, I believe, as the 3G expansion band. Well, actually, it's actually ended up being the 4G band rather than the 3G band. And Europe has essentially taken the lead in award of this band. Most countries in Europe started awarding the spectrum from 2007 onwards, mostly using this paired-unpaired band plan. But several Asian-Pacific countries have also followed. I've got a list on the slide. And many countries, particularly the ones that have most recently adopted it, have chosen to follow the CBT band plan with a mix of paired and unpaired spectrum. And again, there are lots and lots of devices that support this band. So looking at the latest numbers from the GSA, 2,638 devices have been launched that support this band. This is the paired part of the band, and 1,207 devices that support the unpaired band, LTE-TDD. So again, probably 70-80% of the phones in this room probably support these bands. In the US has taken its own approach and has an unpaired band plan. The spectrum is mainly held by Sprint there, and that band is getting into US handsets slowly. But again, given so many handsets already support this band, given there is a need for more spectrum, to me, not in all countries, but to me in a lot of countries, I think there's an opportunity for a quick win here of making more spectrum available for industry. You know, while we're waiting for digital switchover to occur, it may take a bit of time for the 700 to become available. This is an option of providing additional high-frequency spectrum to supplement the 1800 band with a lot of handset support and a quick win. But I think the key thing is for this region, particularly the Asia part of the Asia-Pacific region, to coordinate in terms of striving to set a timescale for making this band available, and individual national regulators committing to industry and operators a plan for making this spectrum available. So that was my quick intro and a plea for a couple of bands, for the region to consider a couple of bands and do what you can to make the spectrum available. Back to this more general topic now of how do we resolve the spectrum crunch in the short to medium term. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 very distinguished speakers, and can I introduce the first of those? It's Peng Zhang, who's with the GSM Association, and he's going to talk about why we have the spectrum crunch and what new bands can help us overcome these. So can I welcome Peng to take the stage?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizer for allowing me to be back on the stage to speak in front of this audience. From my perspective as GSMA, we would just like to share a bit of our views on whether we will be facing a spectrum crunch and how we see the best way to tackle it. So I was going to show you a few statistics. I think you probably all know that, and we've seen several of them in the past day and a half. Just know that smartphone adoption is growing, traffic collection is growing, the total data on the network is growing. But this fourth graph here may be a bit more interesting for you. You probably haven't seen that. I found that from Bellax Consulting this year. It shows the relative growth of data traffic on the network by region. So what they use as a reference point is North America, US, Canada. That's the blue line you see in the middle. That's the growth rate year on year. And then they traced several other graphs, several other curves. Which is showing the growth, relative growth compared to North America. So you can see China in there. You can see the Asia Pacific just below the North America. China is slightly higher. But EA and MEA, that's emerging Asia and emerging Middle East and Africa. And they reckon that by 2020, the growth of those regions will be twice higher, or more, twice or even more higher than the North America. Why do they think that? I think they explain that by one of the major reasons to explain that is the fixed infrastructure. In this region particularly, and in Middle East and Africa, the fixed infrastructure is maybe not as extensive as the North America or Europe. So they have much more traffic from the mobile that they cannot offload to the Wi-Fi, for example, or to the other fixed infrastructure. So they believe that the growth of mobile data is much higher than in North America. So I think this slide is a bit similar to what Amit showed you earlier. We have more or less 4 ways to tackle the growth and to try to keep at the same speed as the growth of data traffic. So those 4 ways are to increase the spectrum efficiency. So I think my fellow speaker will speak more in detail about that. Denser network, so deploying more cell sites, but that of course has a huge impact on the cost, on CapEx and OpEx, so on the investment. The offloading, as I just mentioned, that may or may not possible depending on the region, so the amounts that can be offloaded may not be as much as we would like to. But still, many operators are still deploying Wi-Fi hotspots strategy as well, just to take the pressure off some of the hotspots in the cities. But again, like any Wi-Fi deployment, there's no guarantee of quality of service. It's just like the Wi-Fi in this room. Yesterday morning, it took me 50 minutes to connect. This morning, for myself, at least it took me less than 1 minute, but it's hit and miss, right? So there's no guarantee of quality of service. So again, from an operator point of view, the most cost efficient and most cost-efficient way to increase the capacity of the network would be additional licensed spectrum. So, if we look at the existing spectrum from APAC, so I listed here all the various bands that have been identified for IoT before WRC 15. Several of those, I think Amit already touched 2.3 and 2.6. In the APT700, we mentioned that several times as well. And the other we can call that core 2G and 3G bands are listed here as well. WRC 15, that gave us a few more choice, a few more options to tackle this spectrum crunch. The 700, of course, as we already mentioned yesterday and as mentioned by several speakers of the day, is a key one. So it's coming up after WRC. We already have that in this region since WRC 07, but I think the good news this year from WRC 15 is that the Agility 1.2 allows the whole region 1 to join this big ecosystem. So it's even bigger, and so we have almost global between Asia, Latin, and Africa, Middle East, and Europe. It's quite a key band for the future. The N-band, again, another harmonized band across the whole world. I would say it's just a shame that it's only 91 megahertz, but still we can we take whatever we can. The other band I want to mention as a coverage band as well is the sub-700 UHF, so 470 to 694. There are several countries in this region who identify that for IMT. Of course, the US incentive auction will happen really soon, so by the end of this month. And you will probably see the new band plan from the FCC, which they have done with the FDD band plan, pairs of 5 megahertz block. Now that they know how many people from broadcasting, how many broadcasting channels they will be able to auction, they will show the band plan really soon. So this big ecosystem, that's something not to be missed as well. And especially we know that in, for example, South Asia, this band is really not that much used for broadcasting service. And the thing we should not forget is in APAC, in Region 3, this part of the band is already co-primary mobile. So it's not only for people, for the few countries who identify themselves in this WRC 15, but could be for the others as well. Now a few capacity bands. C-band, as I mentioned yesterday, we already have that since for the 10 major economies in the region. We have 2 more countries who joined, and more importantly, it's being in Region 1 and Region 2, it's also basically as at least 3.4 to 3.6, and 3.6, 3.7, we already have that as well in North America after this WRC. So the band plan has been defined for a while as UGP. Also, we also have a band plan from 3GPP on 3638, which could be used by Europe in the future. 3334 by several markets in Asia, but also in most of Africa as well. So it's again, it's a huge ecosystem that is will be ready for the future. And 4849, as mentioned as well, China and Japan are pushing together, and we have several countries in this region who identify that for energy. So what's next? So we have, I mentioned six new bands that's possible after this WRC 15. But that's only really the start of to make the ecosystem available and to have it deployed commercially. So we have to plan the bands for the ones who doesn't have a band planned yet. We have to look at which band would be most needed depending on which market, and we have to see to develop policies and licensing conditions as well. And most importantly, we have to update the roadmap, and we have to create a roadmap when it doesn't exist, but update the roadmap, existing roadmap to include those new bands, and those roadmap are really important for the mobile industry to have the certainty for the outlook for the next 5 years at least. Because certainty, that's the most required criteria for any investment. I give an example of what has been done in one of the European countries. So when they have looked, Plum Consulting has looked at the UK roadmap for the spectrum, the really long term, until 2028. And you can see that they have put in all the new bands from the WRC 15 as well. So it includes 1.4 gigahertz, which is an L band. It also includes the 3.6, but also in the future they are also looking at 3638 and 3842 on the longer term. So that's only for the case of UK. But for each country, you need to see, okay, what is when would be the spectrum needed, and what type of spectrum. So do we need the lower frequency spectrum first, or do we need the capacity spectrum first? And also, you have to consider the ecosystem. When will it be available? When will it be mature and cheap enough to deploy in your own country? And really important is you have to consider when the band can be cleared. So it's a different question that you need to pose before being able to come up with such a long-term view. Right. I think that's more or less what I wanted to share today. But the last slide is just to remind you that the WRC 19 is really key, because the long-term planning that you need after each WRC to have it to make it commercially available. You need to start to think about even more bands in the future. So WRC 19, the item 1.13 is really key, and as I can only repeat what other speaker has said before, we encourage all demonstration, region to participate to the IT work, and to also participate to the regional APT work, to start to find a more harmonized way to address the WRC 19 issues. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you for that presentation, Peng, including the tour of the different frequency bands. So, if I can introduce our next speaker, it's Taylor Lamb from Analysis Mason, and he's going to talk about the refarming of the existing GSM 3G spectrum for use for 4G.
Thank you, the organizer, for inviting me over here, and I'm honored to be here to speak to you all regarding some of our experience on 2G, 3G refarming. the agenda for the presentation is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to go a little over what analysis Mason is, and then I'll quickly go into the need for 2G, 3G refarming, and then this presentation will be slightly different from some of the other presentations that you have seen, whereby I'll try to come in with from more of an operator's angle to try and shed some light on what mobile operators are thinking when they're doing 2G, 3G refarmings. So hopefully by the end of it, it will also stimulate some thinking from, I understand most of you in the audience are coming from the regulators' side of things, to consider operators' thinking when you're determining 2G, 3G refarming policies. So very quickly, Analysis Mason is a TMT specialized consulting. We're headquartered in the UK, it's been around for 30 years. For Asia, we first established in Singapore about 11 years ago, and we have been working with both regulators and operators in this part of the world on various regulatory, spectrum, technical, and commercial issues. In particular, in terms of spectrum-related work, in this part of the world, we have been involved in many of the latest spectrum auctions in Asia Pacific. In Europe, we also work extensively with both regulators and operators. Now, going into the meat of the presentation, first I want for us to try and get a feeling of the inevitability of 2G, 3G refarming. So on the left-hand side, what you will see is the projection of number of connections by 2G, 3G, and 4G technology. So it's unmistakable that we are seeing a very fast pace of 4G connections gaining a lot of ground. So we're actually expecting that in about 2 years' time, globally, you have roughly a 1/3 split between 2G, 4G, and 3G technologies. But this is just the number of connectivity split. If you actually break down into traffic split, it will be much more heavily skewed towards 4G data traffic because of the data rates they can offer, because of the user's behavior. So because of this, everyone knows that 4G spectrum demand is going to be a great concern, which has been spoken about again and again over the past day or two. But on the other hand, if we look at the deployment of 4G networks, so on the other side of the chart, you have an exhibit that shows of the current 4G deployed network, what types of spectrum bands are they being deployed on. And the ones highlighted in dark blues are deployed on spectrum frequencies that are from the old 2G and 3G technologies. So obviously 1800 is the most popular LTE band. It's a well-famous GSM band. And if you count towards the whole chart, basically the key thing is roughly half the current LTE networks are already deployed on 2G, 3G bands. So refarming is happening, it's just to what extent. Then, if we take this idea of refarming to an extreme end, you will quickly lead to a logical conclusion whereby it will lead to a switch off of either 2G or 3G, one of those, or maybe both, of the legacy networks. And countries are already doing it or talking about it. So, on one hand, if you look at the switch off of 2G network, Singapore, USA, Australia, they're all talking about a potential 2G switch off in 2016, 2017. 3G switch off network is also talked about. So in Europe, it's frequently mentioned that 3G will be switched off, but probably at a later date. You're looking at about 5-6 years ahead. But many countries are already looking at the potential of 3G switch off. But an actual switch off of a legacy network comes with several challenges. And the complete switch off is often very, very challenging. On this page, I've listed a number of challenges that operators will face when they want to switch off either a 2G or a 3G network. And they are handset-related issues, end-to-end related issues, and roaming-related issues. So if we first look at a potential 2G network switch off, handset-related issues, handsets, 2G handsets, although I imagine most of you in the room would not still have a 2G handset, but in particular in this part of the world, we still have a reasonably high 2G penetration, and 2G handsets do last for a very, very long time. For example, someone in my family is still using a 2G phone from 5, 6, 7 years ago. Okay, and they just don't break. Because of that, it poses a great challenge, because even if an operator has successfully swapped out a 2G SIM with a 3G or 4G SIMs, there are just many users who simply will hold on to their 2G handsets. One example is recently I'm working with one of the operators in Asia Pacific, and what we found is that even though they have migrated into 4G for almost 3 years now, a substantial number of the subscribers, we're looking at a single-digit percentage of the subscribers are still using their 2G handset. When we first found out about this, it was very surprising for us. The other issue is end-to-end. A lot of the older end-to-end deployment was deployed using GSM or GPRS technology. And in order to swap those out, it's practically impossible, because those systems is probably one of the early days of Internet of Things deployment, and there are literally thousands of sensors out there which need to be replaced if you need to switch off the network. Thirdly, it's about the roaming issues. Probably less of an issue for 2G customers, more so for 3G. But because in this region, we still have a lot of 2G, 3G, definitely 3G customers, and when they travel, they need a roaming network. A switch off of a particular technology network will definitely lead to roaming losses. Because of these three reasons, the outlook respectively for Southeast Asia would be, I'd just like to quickly talk about it. 2G handset device I've just mentioned is very difficult to do, last forever, but on the 3G side, it becomes even more challenging, because on the 3G side, a lot of people are still holding on their 3G handsets. M2M is less of an issue, because in general, when compared to, say, the US and the Europe, M2M development is still relatively nascent, so the problem of switching off a network and the impact of disruption to M2M network is relatively less. Roaming is a big issue. There are a lot of roamers that are still using legacy technologies. So, complete switch off is challenging, and what are the operators thinking? Even though earlier on I mentioned that many operators or countries are talking about legacy network switch off, but if you look at the timeline and the way switch off is being announced, what you would notice is that operators tends to be looking at a 5 or even 10-year timeline for legacy network switch off. And even then, a lot of the time, they are only looking at the switch off of one or the other legacy technology, but not both. Simply because of the various reasons that I mentioned, one way or another, there is a need to carry on with one of the legacy technologies in order to service both customers as well as sometimes regulatory obligations. This page looks quickly at a recent analysis that we looked at for an operator on the business case for refarming. So what you will see is that when an operator looks at refarming existing 2G, 3G spectrum into 4G, the simple case of refarming some of the existing legacy network spectrum would give them a lot of benefit. So the majority of the benefit actually comes from refarming, but incomplete refarming. Reason why being, in this part of the world, or even globally, most of the LTE network is still deploying their second or third LTE band. So the ability to refarm a certain band pretty much means you could increase your network capacity by 50% or even 100% if you're adding your second band. Because of this, the spectrum efficiency gain is massive. And therefore, this is where majority of the value of spectrum refarming comes from, which is all the network savings. However, if you move on to the right-hand side of the chart, which means a complete switch-off scenario, whereby you switch off the legacy network, the gain in benefits is not so great, simply because in order to completely switch off the network, there will be a lot of commercial cost involved. You need to find the legacy network customers, you need to give them a replacement handset, sometimes you need to give them special compensation packages. All these add to the cost. And the incremental gain in spectrum is actually not that great. So all in all, the balances is that some home refarming will give them a lot of benefit. However, a complete switch off would really, the benefits is incremental, and there are a lot of implementation challenges which affects this decision. So on this page, I would like to highlight some of the implementation considerations that a typical operator will have to look at in a legacy network switch off before I go into the regulatory approach. Now, roughly you're looking at considerations both from the technical side and the commercial side. On the technical side, if you need to decide when and what network to switch off, you obviously have to look at the data traffic within your network, which starts off from your 4G take-up. You have to look at the SIM take-up, and more importantly, you have to look at the traffic split, because typically all the traffic, as I mentioned, will be skewed towards the 4G. And also the device penetration. Earlier on, I mentioned an example whereby even though you have a 4G network, there may still be some legacy devices, which actually means they're using the legacy network instead of the 4G network. So an understanding of a detailed traffic split down to the device level will therefore allow you to segment the traffic and therefore the impact of the users as the first thing. Second thing is voice strategy, which is not very often being talked about. 4G voice over LTE in many countries is still only just starting. So if you decide to switch off a certain legacy network, you need to think about what is the voice fallback strategy for the whole network, including the 2G, 3G, and 4G. And this has posed some problems to some of the operators that we work with, because, for example, a lot of the operators have built their 3G networks, sometimes with some hole in it, relying on the 2G for the voice fallback layer. But the traffic analysis would often lead to a conclusion that 2G should be networked to switch off. This will immediately raise a dilemma for the operator to consider. So a voice strategy is a somewhat subtle but actually very important part of the technology consideration in a legacy switch-off environment. Thirdly is the M2M and the IoT transition, which I have already spoken about. So on the commercial side, though, this is more of a cost and benefit analysis, whereby the operators usually will have to look at the usage segmentation, as I've mentioned, as well as the revenue potential of the different user group. Once they have prioritized the migration segments, then they have to decide how quickly do they want to migrate it, because obviously there is a natural rate of evolution from 2G, 3G to 4G. But if you want to push it faster, you just have to throw out more incentive. So for each of the segment, there has to be a cost and benefit analysis on how fast do I want to push for the pace of migration, and therefore determine the relevant pricing and offers, which will have to be based on the usage behavior of the prioritized segments. So hopefully so far I've managed to shed some light on how operators are thinking about 2G and 3G refarming. And the last slide I just want to mention, because of the complexity involved and also every country has a different context, we have also observed very different ways whereby regulators also manage the 2G, 3G farming situations. So on this page I've listed a number of examples. Malaysia, for example, recently decided to use direct assignment to be assigned the 900 and 1800 megahertz spectrum, and the rationale mentioned is that the players who was directly assigned the spectrum has sufficient infrastructure to make use of the spectrum, and also the fact that later on there will be more LTE spectrum to come for the other players in the market. In Holland, what they have decided in 2014 for the 2100 megahertz is to delay the 3G license expiry for further until 2020 because of several reasons. First, the biggest consideration is 3G spectrum continuity, and also because earlier on in 2012 there was an option whereby a new entrant was introduced, and they wanted to give the new entrant a bit more time to get involved in the market for the competition dynamics to evolve. And then thirdly, to wait for a bigger spectrum auction when 700 MHz will be available in 2020. In Hong Kong, they have adopted a slightly different approach, whereby the refarming of 2100 MHz was done based on a re-auction, but with a right of first refusal. Again, the key rationale mentioned was 3G spectrum continuity, and the fact that despite this, there are still competing demands of an option, so they have adopted a hybrid approach to make sure that existing 3G operators are not disrupted, but there is also at the same time a market-based mechanism to redistribute this spectrum. On the most extreme end, you have a complete re-auction of the 2G, 3G spectrum, which was adopted by Taiwan in 2013, whereby they auctioned the 700, 900 and 1800 spectrum. This one was a slightly special case whereby they also introduced a lot of new competitors in that auction, and also it complements with the release of some new spectrum in 700. What I do want to take note though is that if a regulator decides to adopt such a complete market-based approach, a regulator is advised to consider very carefully in terms of the potential issues of spectrum continuity. What happened in Taiwan is that different operators bid back. They all try to bid back the existing 900 and 1800 spectrum, but in cases, but there were two blocks whereby the operators did not get it. So you ended up with two operators, each getting the other person's 1800 megahertz spectrum, and that is causing a little bit of a nuisance in the market, and the operators will have to resolve offline in order to manage the refarming issues. Lastly, I want to put out a more provocative thought, but not necessarily a precedent, which is a common legacy network. In Europe, there has been mentioning about setting up a countrywide or even European-wide legacy 2G network in order to serve the need to slowly sunset the 2G technology. Recently in Asia, I've also heard about similar talks about this idea. And obviously, we understand the challenges of doing this, bringing in all the different operators to work on a common network, but this is not unheard of. In the banking sector, this has been done. When the banking sector wants to sunset the check processing technology, they set up a central organization to manage that. And this idea also is somewhat similar to universal service obligations, whereby the industry basically pulled together in order to work jointly on a sunsetting technology. So, in a nutshell, I'm afraid there's not a single silver bullet on how a regulator should approach 2G, 3G refarming, because it depends very heavily on the competition dynamics, the market context, and the regulatory constraints within the individual country. But hopefully it provides some ideas on what are the potential factors to be considered when making such decisions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Taylor. Okay, straight on to our next speaker. Can I introduce Pekka Ojanen, who is Director with Huawei, and Pekka's going to go into more details of some of the means operators can use to overcome data crunches.
Okay, thanks. My presentation was finally found. Amit, thanks for the introduction. Unfortunately, the time is very short, so that I can go too deep into the details. But of course, the idea is to address ways to overcome spectrum crunch, some ways, and of course, this is also a view from the manufacturer's viewpoint. Okay. It's always interesting to find out that how much other speakers have covered the same topics. And of course, ways to overcome spectrum crunch, it's so that there are certain ways, and they are basically well known. On the other hand, I'm not very worried about if there is some overlap, because that's also encouraging in that sense, that the ideas that people have, they tend to go to a certain direction, and they probably then are useful ideas. And some of these things have been discussed already many times actually during this conference, so I don't want to use too much for this introduction. And also the spectrum crunch itself, the lack of possible or potential lack of spectrum, that's nothing new. But of course, we should not think that there is nothing new, because the world is changing all the time. But it's a long time since we already spoke about new services, new users, more traffic, wider coverage. All these things have been needed. But what is definitely new and a big challenge is that the scale is completely different. I mean, now we are talking about billions of whatever, and for example, 1.5 billion unconnected to get them connected. You may have different numbers, but anyway, it's about billions. 10 times capacity, okay, could be 10, 50, whatever numbers, but it's still a lot of capacity is needed. Higher speeds, there are many reasons for that. 1 gigabit, well, some people are saying that it's X times gigabits. And then of course we have this Internet of Things, 1 billion things. That is definitely something new. It puts new challenges on the implementation. And this graph basically shows some examples of how much spectrum has been really made into use. And there is APT, some countries from the APT area, CEPT, and so regions. And typically it's from 360 to 790. And then the dotted lines, the horizontal dotted lines, they represent the ITU predictions. Most of you know that ITU has estimated the spectrum requirements for the purpose of making the right decisions at the WRC. And this exercise was first done before the WRC 07, and now it was updated before the last WRC. And the lower dotted line represents the lower market settings result of the ITU calculations, and the upper dotted line represents the ITU's higher market settings based calculations. So even this estimate varies between 1300 and 2000 megahertz. And of course, the actual situation in different countries is different, because there is different background and different needs, different geography. Many things have an impact on that. But of course, it's obvious that more spectrum will be needed. And of course it would be nice to have some magic to do that, but of course if I would have this magic, then many others would have the same magic, and anyway it would be a big mess. So I actually prefer the ITU way, even if sometimes it's time-taking and result in compromises. But okay, compromises are needed. Okay, some solutions instead of magic. And it's interesting because many solutions basically are the old solutions. So more spectrum, that's quite obvious. For example, after the previous WRC, I talked to people, and many people said that they were disappointed about the results. And last week I was in a meeting where I was presenting some spectrum topics, and one of the participants said that, why do I keep repeating that it's so difficult and difficult and difficult? And I said, but it is difficult. But then I thought about it myself and said that, okay, it is difficult, but so far we have been still lucky to find more spectrum. Of course, then there is a need to improve the efficiency of individual technologies, and that has also been possible all the time over the years. Future technologies typically will be more spectrum efficient than the old technologies. That's important. So deployment of new technologies helps in providing higher capacity, which helps in the spectrum requirements. Then more sites, that's kind of traditional. Talking about smaller cells, that's one way. And then also, I mean, there's a need to implement more connections. This is especially related to the 1 billion of things. I think this is one way to handle this is to do it by standardization, so that there will be technical implementations which can do this very nicely. And then what is important, I think this has basically already been mentioned, that we have been discussing, and there have been presentations about mix of bands. I think somebody mentioned that, maybe it was one of the presentations here. But anyway, in the past it was so that we were able to talk about macro cells, microcells, picocells, and then there was maybe a certain amount of spectrum, and that had to be organized so that this 3-layer structure was, or hierarchical network structure was possible. And today, I think it's also a benefit, but it's also a challenge. There are a number of bands. Of course, it's giving freedom for individual countries to pick and choose and try to make available what can be made available. And then for those who are implementing the technology, there is of course some challenge that the number of bands becomes very huge. It's a challenge for the antenna, it's a challenge for the radio parts, it's a challenge for the implementation in general. But for the implementation of networks, I think it's a big benefit, because it is possible to choose a set of frequencies, set of bands, and that allows in taking into account the different requirements. The range of requirements is very wide. So there is the coverage requirement. In this pyramid we call it MBB coverage layer, and of course it's so that the lower bands will help in deploying the networks in rural areas and where the coverage is important. It has been so that in the lower bands the bandwidths have been quite limited, maybe 2 times 10 megahertz blocks. Let's see what happens if there is more spectrum from the UHF band. Here I mentioned 700, 800, 900 megahertz. And then in the middle, what we have, what is called here in the pyramid, MBB speed. It's the capacity layer, and it covers the new L band, 1800, 2100, 2.3, 2.6 gigahertz. And it seems that in those bands, the higher we go in frequency range, it's possible to find or assign actually wider bandwidths for the operators. And then there is also this remark related to the capacity layer. Technology neutrality allows technology evolution. For example, in the golden 1800 and 2100 MHz bands. Of course, we have a certain meaning for technology neutrality, like was discussed earlier today. I will come back to that after a while. But like I said, it's useful to be able to deploy the latest technology because then the spectrum efficiency is higher, and that's a big benefit. And then the topmost layer, which is called the super data layer, wide bandwidths allow pathway from 4G to 4.5G to 5G. Okay, there are these Gs. It's a bit confusing because there are Gs and Gs. Some Gs are related to gigahertz and some to generations. But anyway, we think that these higher frequencies where the bandwidths can be wider, that's also a possibility to deploy something like 4G and then evolve the technology and go towards the 5G. And I guess typically there could be 40 megahertz blocks which would be useful for the future services and providing the required capacity. Okay, new spectrum. There has been a lot of discussion about WRC 15 today, so I don't want to go to deep details. I just make some few remarks about this. And first remark is that